Hey everyone, so this is the third of the low and stable inflation rate mini-series, which is part of the macroeconomic objectives series. That's unit 2.3.2. Well, actually, it's unit 2.3 of the IB economic syllabus. In this video, I'm going to explain using a diagram that demand pull inflation is caused by changes in the determinant of aggregate demand. I'm going to explain using a diagram that cost-push inflation is caused by an increase in the costs of the factors of production, resulting in a decrease in SRAS, short-run aggregate supply, and then I'm going to evaluate government policies to deal with the different types of inflation. So let's get started. So the first type of inflation is called demand pull inflation. This is obviously from the name, caused by any increase in aggregate demand, maybe due to an increase in consumption spending or investment spending or government spending or export spending or a fall in import spending. So anything that increases one of the components of aggregate demand and leads to an increase in aggregate demand will cause demand pull inflation. So this is the neoclassical view of demand pull inflation. Essentially, we'll assume that the economy begins at full employment. It's producing Y, FE, and one of the components of aggregate demand increases from AD to AD1. So it shifts from AD to AD1. Now, the average price level rises from PLFE all the way to PL1. This is called demand pull inflation. An increase in aggregate demand will always raise the average price level and cause demand pull inflation, according to neoclassical economists. Because neoclassical economists believe that the economy always adjusts itself to reach full employment level of output. So any increase in aggregate demand is believed by neoclassical economists to cause demand pull inflation. The Keynesian economists, on the other hand, don't always agree. They believe that demand pull inflation will only occur if the economy is at full employment. So if there's spare capacity in the economy, any increase in aggregate demand will not cause demand pull inflation. If the economy is at full employment, then any increase in aggregate demand will cause inflation. So here we begin at full employment, AD, and something happens that causes aggregate demand to rise to AD1. As you can see, the average price level rose from PL to PL1. So there is here, we say there is demand pull inflation because there's no spare capacity in the economy. The economy is at full employment. So they believe that not all increases in AD will cause demand pull inflation. Only when the economy is at full employment, producing YFE, any further increase in AD will cause demand pull inflation. So what are some policies to deal with demand pull inflation? Well, there are several. The government will have to adopt contractionary, that cause contraction of economic activity, or sometimes we call them deflationary demand-side policies. Since demand pull inflation is caused by increases in AD, it would make sense that the government will use policies to lower aggregate demand. So the government could adopt deflationary fiscal policy, which includes raising direct and indirect taxes and lowering government spending, or it could adopt contractionary monetary policy or deflationary monetary policy, where the central bank will raise interest rates and reduce the money supply. Now remember, the learning outcome is to evaluate those policies, not just to describe them and explain them, but to evaluate them. So, however, the problem with those contractionary and deflationary policies is raising taxes and cutting government spending is very politically unpopular. So it might upset the voting population. If you're a democratic leader looking to be re-elected, they're not going to be happy if you raise taxes and you cut government spending. Government budget cuts are not easy because of the government's commitments to the public. There are a lot of things that it's the government committed to the public that the government really can't reduce, like pension spending or several of the welfare payments or disability payments. So many different types of spending the government's committed to. There are usually very long time lags involved in making changes to fiscal policy or making government budget cuts. Even if you pass these budget cuts, there's a long time lag in seeing the effect of these cuts on inflation. Also, remember that higher interest rates will hurt borrowers and debtors. So if the central bank decides to raise interest rates, borrowers and people who owe debt will be hurt by that. And people who have taken out loans and mortgages will not be very happy. Also remember that deflationary policies may deal with inflation, but they cause higher unemployment and they slow down economic growth. So while you are attempting to solve one problem, you could be creating others. A very important point you need to remind yourself of now, or keep in mind, is that nowadays monetary policy is often viewed as being more effective in managing aggregate demand and fighting against inflation. This is because central banks are often independent of the government. They are often independent institutions and they don't need to worry about being re-elected. So these are policies to deal with demand pull inflation, their strengths and weaknesses. Fantastic. Now let's move on to the second type of inflation, cost push inflation. This is inflation that is caused by an increase in the costs of the factors of production, which leads to a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. So as I said earlier, it's caused by increases in the costs of production. Maybe increases in the costs of labor. This is called wage push inflation. Or maybe increases in the costs of domestic raw materials, or increases in the costs of imported capital and imported raw materials. Even if there's a fall in the value of the country's currency, imports might become more expensive, and if countries rely on a lot of imported raw materials, this could all lead to cost push inflation. So as you can see here, assuming again the economy is at full employment and there's an increase in cost of production, SRAS shifts from SRAS to SRAS1, and the price level rises from PL to PL1, and the level of output falls from YFE to Y1, just here. Okay, now this is cost push inflation. Before I continue to the policies that the government adopts to deal with cost-push inflation, it's important to remember, and this is the scary thing about inflation, inflation has a tendency to perpetuate itself and create an inflationary spiral. So let's assume a scenario where there's an increase in aggregate demand from AD to AD1. So demand pull inflation will lead to a higher average price level, which means that the costs of production will also rise because the workers will demand higher wages. These rises in the costs of production will then cause cost-push inflation, causing the average price level to rise even further. As you can see, SRAS will then, in the long run, shift to SRAS1. Now, with the higher wages, workers will spend more, causing even more demand pull inflation, and AD1 will shift to maybe AD2, and the cycle goes on. So the government usually has to interfere and sort of nip inflation at the bud so that it doesn't become worse. Okay? So, some policies to deal with cost-push inflation. Now, it's not enough to explain or give those policies. You have to evaluate them and look at their strengths and weaknesses, long-term and short-term effects. So, the government uses supply-side policies. Remember, demand-pull inflation, the government uses demand-side policies. Cost-push inflation, the government can adopt supply-side policies to boost the productivity of the factors of production and increase the economy's productive capacity. Maybe there could be negotiations with labor unions to match higher wages with increased productivity and therefore control inflationary wage pressures. The government could also subsidize industries to moderate the increases in the costs of production. So industries that are facing really high rises in the costs of production, the government could subsidize them. Also, if the country has a fixed exchange rate, it could revalue, so raise the value of its currency, and this makes imports cheaper. But this only works if the country has a fixed exchange rate, not a floating exchange rate. We'll talk about this when we do international economics. However, the effects of supply-side policies are usually long-term and they do not appear in the short run. Also, subsidizing industries usually entails a huge opportunity cost because this is money that could be spent elsewhere, and the government has a limited budget. Revaluation of the currency will make imports cheaper, but guess what? It makes your exports more expensive, so it will hurt your export competitiveness. Foreign countries might not purchase your exports as much. In practice, however, It's not always easy to identify or isolate the exact causes of inflation. It's very easy in an economics classroom using diagrams and all of that to talk about the different types and causes of inflation. But in practice, inflation is just inflation. And so governments will often use a combination of demand-side contractionary policies as well as supply-side policies. So we've talked about the different types of inflation, we've illustrated them using diagrams, and we talked about possible policies to deal with each, as well as the limitations or the weaknesses or disadvantages of those policies. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a great week.